Wonderful to see everyone and have you all here. I am super excited about this panel. This is another one of our learning labs that I've been talking a little bit about, and this one is a pretty important topic: how will we feed our planet? Super excited this afternoon to introduce our terrific moderator, Jake Felser, and right, give it up, and our panelists, Lauren Hafford, Christy Lee. I'm sorry, okay, we'll wait to the end. You guys are really being very nice. Elle Stupin and Mariko Thorbecke. So in the next hour, you will hear them talk about our food system, regenerative agriculture, climate change, what we can do about all of this, and improving our food system. We will be taping this, as it will be followed up in November with part 2 of this series. We wanted to do it sooner, but the people that are in part 2 are farmers, and they're in the middle of harvest. So Brennan Clark McFeeters and Tiana Veldwich will do part 2 in early November, so stay tuned for that. They will, we're really excited to have that. As this panel was working on all this, they said, you've got to have the actual farmers. Let's see if we can get them after the harvest. So excited about that. With all that, I am excited to turn things over to our host, Jake Felser, class of 11, CTO of Freight Farms.
Thank you, Sally. I'd start by just saying it's great to be here. I don't think I've spent very much time at Olin recently, and yeah, it's just awesome to see everybody and a lot of familiar faces and some less familiar faces, and it's very cool that we're all here to talk about agriculture. I think it's an incredibly important topic. We're going to talk about different elements of it and how each of us got into it as well, which wasn't necessarily our focus at Olin, but we've all kind of fallen into it over time. And let's just start by introducing ourselves. I guess start with your year at Olin, what you're working on, and how you got into ag-related work. And Lauren, you want to kick us off?
Hey, I'm Lauren, year of 07. And what was the question? I'm sorry.
What you're working on and how you got into it?
Okay, so I'm working with farmers who are innovating in soil health and practicing regenerative agriculture. And I got into it after reading an article about soil carbon sequestration and then cold calling the farmer, and he showed me around, and I was like, holy moly, what can I do to support you?
Hi everyone, I'm Christy. I'm also the class of 07, represent. And I am the founder of Nourishing Food Marketing. I help bring climate-friendly brands to market. So that means that someone somewhere, a farmer potentially, has an idea and says, I want to get this in front of consumers. I want to actually sell this and change how food is made. I help them do that from a marketing perspective. And you may be thinking, gosh, she went to Olin, but I also went to HBS, Harvard Business School, so that's a little bit part of that transition. And I think the other thing that I want to say is that food is so important because, yes, we do it every day. We eat food, but we also have this emotional connection to our food that allows us to think about other questions in our lives through the lens of food. And I can talk about food all day, every day, and probably could eat all day, every day. So I'm excited about this conversation, and also to talk about why food is a really good solution for climate change in general.
Hi, I'm Elle. I had a very circuitous route to agriculture. Originally, I was looking for a company that could tackle climate change at scale. And then I started learning about the emissions that come from agriculture, and my current company does sustainable fertilizer from microbes, and it has the potential to eliminate 500 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So that's what I'm excited about.
Hey everyone, my name is Mariko. I graduated in 2016, so not part of the 07 crew here, unfortunately. I am an independent consultant specializing in climate change and agriculture. A large part of my work is helping clients to understand what a future planet stabilized at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming will actually look like, what some of the consequences will be of warming at that level, what it will actually take to achieve the stabilization at that level. So I do a lot of carbon accounting work for food and ag companies, ranging from the corporate level all the way down to looking at greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration at the farm level. Okay, how did I get into this? I got into the food and ag sector work mostly because I think, similar to Christy, I'm just a really big fan of food. My husband and I actually have a 2-acre homestead. We started out with a garden and then got some chickens and then got some goats and then got some ducks. So it's been a little bit crazy, but a really fun journey. And I found that having a career in the food and ag sector allows me to kind of exercise both of these passions in both my work and my home life.
So Mariko, maybe we can stay with you for a second. And one thing you talked about is climate change. And I think, we're talking specifically about sustainable agriculture, everyone on the panel. Maybe you could outline for us a little bit of what the ties are really between agriculture and climate change and how they impact each other to kind of set the stage.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So agriculture really impacts climate change in 2 main ways. The first is pretty obvious. That's anytime fossil fuels are burnt. Within agriculture, there is plenty of fossil fuels that are embedded. So this can be in the production of energy-intensive synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. There's quite a bit of fossil emissions there. This can be on-farm through the combustion of diesel in on-farm machinery such as tractors. And then the other main way is when our biogenic carbon cycles and other nutrient cycles, such as the nitrogen cycle, are out of balance. So the biogenic carbon cycle, you can think of that as any carbon that is flowing through our natural systems, flowing through plants, through animals. These are natural parts of our system. If you think of photosynthesis, cellular respiration, decomposition, these are emissions that would occur even if humans weren't involved. So these are kind of the 2 main pools of emissions that we're thinking about when we think about climate change. And what's really, really important is that these 2 emissions pools actually have different goals when it comes to stabilizing warming. For our fossil carbon emissions, the goal is really to phase those out completely by 2050. The goal is to not be burning any fossil fuels in any sector by 2050. With biogenic emissions, however, they're a little bit different because, again, the goal is to rebalance those cycles of plants and animals. And this is where something like regenerative agriculture and a focus on soil health can really play an important role. Because that will allow us to have agricultural systems where we're integrating livestock, we're rebalancing the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and ultimately leading to systems that are sequestering more carbon in plant biomass or in soils than are being emitted through the process. And then when we think about the impacts of climate change on agriculture, you guys are probably already seeing quite a few impacts on the news, but ultimately, we're going to continue to experience this will vary depending on the region, but we're going to see increases in droughts, increases in flooding, increases in heat waves, wildfires, really just more and more adverse weather events. And ultimately, a lot of regions are no longer going to be able to produce some of the crops that they have been producing for many years. And other regions may actually benefit by having longer growing seasons as the climate warms and kind of shifts those weather patterns. But ultimately, without some pretty serious focus on both adaptation and also resilience in our ag systems, we're going to see pretty significant supply chain disruptions that are going to occur.
And if I can provide some context on agriculture within climate change in general, because that was an amazing sort of deep dive in agriculture. 3 of Project Drawdown's top 15 ways for us to address climate change are agricultural based. So that's from the Rocky Mountain Institute. They have cataloged and looked at system modeling of how much greenhouse gases are coming from where and how we can actually do that. And agriculture and food and also fibers, your clothing, things like that, they are actually the only industry that you can look at and say, actually, I can be a carbon sink. I can be carbon negative. You know, producing electricity, there will be a time where we can get to carbon neutral, but we won't necessarily be able to actually sequester carbon in the soil, which is what we're doing with healthy soils. And so we really have an opportunity with agriculture to not just get to like net zero carbon neutral, to actually go and make up for some of the impact that's already in the world. You know, if we stop today, all the lights turn off, all the cars stop driving, it's still not enough because we have put so much carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we're going to continue to heat up. So what can we do in order to start to buy back that balance, pay off that debt that we've created?
So I think one of those ways is regenerative ag, and Mariko talked about it. Lauren, I think question to you is, what is that really? Like, what is regenerative ag when it comes to what does the farmer actually do?
Yeah, so I guess quick show of hands, who's heard of regenerative agriculture, soil carbon sequestration, soil health? Okay, so a lot of us are on the same page. So there's a revolution happening in American agriculture right now where producers are finding ways to turn their back on industrial chemical agriculture and moving to working with Mother Nature to achieve these same goals. So everything we used fertilizers for, Mother Nature has cycles for that, and so working in concert with her. And broadly, this is regenerative ag, these are soil health practices. So you're talking cover crops, no-till, you're talking integrating livestock, what am I missing? Living root, you're talking like keeping plants alive all year to keep those cycles going. And it has a lot of environmental co-benefits. So when you are rebuilding soils on your land, you're also increasing biodiversity, you're increasing pollinators, you can get some water quality benefits, you can get some soil carbon sequestration. Like there's, it's a transformation that's visible and tactile and obvious to the producer who does it. But it's hard. It's really hard. When you work with Mother Nature, she doesn't care if you're profitable. And likewise, your banker doesn't care about your pollinator counts. So for you to stay in business and keep the land that you're on and not have that sold to your neighbor who might till it all up or whatever, it's really hard. And so all of these producers, right now we're like way early in the technology adoption curve. So all the ones who are doing it are primary researchers on their land, and they are trying to figure out a combination of practices that will work, that won't cause crop failures, that won't change the balance for their cash crop, that they have the equipment for, that they have the infrastructure for, and on and on and on. And it's a big, big journey. And these producers who are doing it are also risking their own family's wealth, their own $500,000 annual operating loans. They are the bravest entrepreneurs I've ever worked with, and it is an honor to serve them. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. The follow-up was going to be what are some of the barriers to adoption, but I think you covered that. I mean, one of the primary inputs that is worth talking about is fertilizer, because it's a huge part of sort of traditional ag, and there's all kinds of challenges with fertilizer in the world right now with Ukraine and lots of fertilizers made there. Even ignoring all of that, Mariko, maybe you can tell us sort of some of the challenges with synthetic fertilizer from a sustainability standpoint to start, and then Laura, you can, or Elle, you can talk about sort of what your company is doing to address a lot of that.
Yeah, so synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is a really big topic in this industry, and a big challenge is that it's not very straightforward. So from a climate standpoint, we do see very significant fossil carbon emissions associated with the production of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And what most people also fixate on is the fact that nitrous oxide, which stems from the overuse of nitrogen fertilizer, is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's more than 250 times more potent than carbon dioxide when we look at the global warming potential. However, a lot of people get fixated on that, and it's actually a little bit more nuanced because, for example, N2O emissions are a much smaller piece of our overall global climate change picture. In 2019, N2O emissions only represented around 6% of our emissions. And in addition, what we found is that when we look at the emissions models for how we stabilize warming to 1.5 degrees, that we can actually increase our N2O emissions. We can actually emit more N2O emissions and still be able to stabilize warming. So what I've actually found is that climate is not always the best lens to look at synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and that potentially shifting to a focus of looking at, say, the water pollution impacts could be a more productive conversation. We ultimately have, a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, equivalent to, I think, something like 4 million acres, all stemming from nitrogen fertilizer use. We also have unsafe drinking water, unsafe recreational water, really across the country. And so I think that there's really an opportunity here to think both from a climate change perspective, but also from a water pollution perspective as we figure out how to tackle these unsustainable impacts.
Great, yeah, so there's a lot of challenges with nitrogen. And at PivotBio, we're changing the way that nitrogen works as a fertilizer. So if you're on this half of the room, just raise your hand with me. If you've got a hand, raise it. So half of us, this half, we would not be alive today without the Haber-Bosch process. So you can put your hand down. Does anybody know what the Haber-Bosch process is or how it works? Yeah, shout it out.
It's a process for mixing synthetic nitrogen from atmospheric nitrogen using nuclear catalyst.
Yes. Absolutely, spot on. So the air that we breathe is actually 80% nitrogen, 78% nitrogen. We're swimming in nitrogen, but it's not in a form that plants can use. So exactly right, 100 years ago, Haber and Bosch created this process that takes it out of the air and creates ammonia. And that's responsible for half the world population being alive today. It's what enabled us to produce as much food as we can. So it's nuanced. It's really an important process, and it does have these challenges. One being that it's very energy intensive, high pressure, high temperature, you need a lot of energy to make ammonia. The challenge number two is that when it's delivered to the field as a fertilizer, only half of that nitrogen makes it into the plant. The other half is lost. It runs into the rivers, it runs into the streams, it gets emitted as nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So what we're doing is we're changing how fertilizer works. We're using microbes instead. So microbes are nature's original way of nitrogen fixation, right? They have enzymes that allow them to take the nitrogen from the air and turn it into a format the plant can use. The challenge there is that some plants know how to recruit these microbes, like beans, soybeans, legumes, some trees, some shrubs can do that. But a lot of other plants like grains, corn, they don't have that ability to recruit those microbes to help them. So we cultivate microbes that you can apply to the seed of corn, for example, when it's planted. They stay with the plant and grow with it, and they're spoon feeding it nitrogen throughout the season. The amazing thing here is you can eliminate 98% of the production energy that went into it. You can eliminate the same amount from the transport because the microbes are much smaller. Imagine an elephant that is made out of urea, solid nitrogen fertilizer. You can deliver that same amount of fertilizer with a gallon of milk that's full of microbes, right? It's somewhere between, it's close to 1,000x reduction in size because you're not actually transporting the nitrogen. And so, it's a really interesting time to be alive because nobody has really changed nitrogen delivery in the past 100 years. And now we're starting to take a crack at it. And to Lauren's point, that nature doesn't care if you're profitable, but the farmers care about it. And so we're trying to find that bridge. Here's a way to work with nature that can help you be profitable and also help you lower your synthetic nitrogen application. So that's been really successful, and we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from the growers about that. I've had a farmer tell me that he's been waiting for a product like this for 40 years, and and
he's very proud of you.
And this year we sold over 3 million acres of microbes and enabled like thousands of farmers to reduce how much synthetic they were applying. So I'm really interested to see where the industry is going to go, because there's a lot of other products besides ours that are a lot of other biological microbial products that can help crops grow. So I think there's a lot of things that are changing and moving right now.
To what extent is it sort of collaborative with regenerative practices versus replacing traditional? I guess you and Lauren as well.
I guess I can start. I see it as a tool, right? And growers can use a tool to fit in with their practice, right? So it is compatible with regenerative practices, and there's a lot of other really important tools, and they kind of you fit them together to build your own nitrogen plan, basically. Absolutely. Yeah.
And part of regenerative is decreasing the inputs that you need in order to grow food or fiber, right? So that's what PivotBio is doing.
So, Christy, let's stay on you for a second. How does this work downstream, right? When it comes to sort of other players in the industry, obviously you can grow all the food in the world, but if you don't get it to the consumer's hands, that farmer's not going to be profitable and it's not going to make an impact. So, tell us a little bit about what you do and what the role of consumer goods companies is in that.
Yeah, for sure. So what Elle was just talking about was all the technical aspects of like, okay, there's like a 1,000 times ratio of like the nitrogen that you have to transport to the field. What I do is help tell that story to consumers, so consumers actually care and purchase it and put it in their mouths. They love it and they come back. If you don't have that, then exactly you don't have adoption, and then you don't have money going back to farmers, and then they can't afford to actually do these really cool practices that are going to help change the world. And so one of the things we do is like for consumers, the message that we would have for reducing, actually you would call it chemical nitrogen fertilizer, not synthetic, because of how consumers think about it, putting yourself in their mindset. And you would say, okay, you have cleaner air, that means cleaner lakes, rivers, and oceans for them to take advantage of. And there's also cleaner water and then cleaner air, which means that, without nitrous oxide, yes, there's the greenhouse gas impact, but actually there's also smog and acid rain impacts to that, which is much, much more tangible to consumers when they think about the benefits to them. Because we ultimately, as consumers and people, are selfish. We care about ourselves and we care about how we are going to live in this world. And so we have to develop products and food and clothing that meets you where you are. Because the honest to goodness truth is that 10% of consumers now pay with their pocketbooks for premium products that they care about that are natural or sustainable in some way, and the rest are just trying to figure things out and make life happen. And we have to meet consumers where they are and say, okay, the onus is on the companies to figure out how to talk about what we're doing in a way that can engage consumers with being climate friendly in a way that makes sense to them.
Do you want to talk about I know you've launched some brands recently, like a snack brand that's explicitly climate forward. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or your experience there? Yeah,
so I launched a brand called Moonshot last year, and it's the US's first climate-friendly snack brand. And climate-friendly, the word sustainable has been co-opted. Sometimes it means something like, oh, it's a little bit better. Like you've seen those like sustainable water bottles because their cap is 30% less plastic. No, climate-friendly means climate-friendly means it's actually good for the planet. And so we source our ingredients from regenerative agriculture farms. We work directly with farmers in order to pay them a premium for what they're doing, and then we talk about it to consumers. And the things that we talk about are, yes, the benefits to them. Regenerative ingredients grown with regenerative agricultural practices are more nutrient dense. So that's great for consumers because you're getting more of those antioxidants and things that we care about and are hard to get. The other thing that we talk about, though, is, and this is a big topic that we can very much outside of the scope of this panel, but environmental justice and social justice go hand in hand. And so we can't address one without addressing the other. And so the thing that we talk about as Moonshot is that, hey, these practices, like, hello, indigenous peoples have been doing this for centuries, right? And then we decided that we sort of like invented that as society today, which is not true. And are implementing that. So we also try to educate about that as well. Hey, we're going back to, like, these lands that we're on today in America were managed by indigenous peoples many, many centuries ago. And so we're here today, and we're trying to fix some of the problems that we created that enabled this half of the auditorium to live, right? And so we've sort of like come up this hill and said, okay, we have all these people now, we have to feed them. How are we gonna do that in a way that, you know, meets all of our needs, both environmentally and socially?
Mariko, I know you've worked with CPG Brands as well. Do you have, you want to add to what Christy said?
Yeah, no, there is huge interest right now from these consumer packaged goods companies, companies like General Mills, companies like Unilever, companies like Nestle, in soil health and regenerative agriculture. If you look on their website, they're all going to have pages on this topic. And what we're actually seeing is millions of dollars flowing from CPGs into this topic, whether it's for research, whether it's for launching on-the-ground pilot projects and programs with farmers. However, one thing that's been pretty interesting to me working in this space is a lot of the projects I've seen have almost taken what I would call a pretty shallow definition of regenerative agriculture, and I'll be curious to hear if you guys are experiencing the same thing, where we'll see kind of corporate-sponsored regenerative agriculture pilot programs where the only practice that is being utilized is something like cover crops. And that's being labeled as a regenerative agriculture project. And you know, when we think about these kind of core tenets of regenerative agriculture, and we're trying to figure out how to minimize our nutrient inputs, kind of rebalance and reclose our nutrient cycles, livestock integration becomes a pretty big core principle. However, what I've seen is some of these pilot programs will be, you know, paying farmers to plant cover crops to grow feed for confined animals regeneratively, instead of figuring out ways to, you know, bring the livestock back into the land to kind of take regenerative agriculture to the next level. So I think there's still room for improvement in the way that CPGs are approaching regenerative agriculture.
And Lauren, from the farmer's perspective, what do they make of this, right? I mean, there's this movement to put regenerative ag on shelves.
Yeah. So I mostly talk to farmers that drunk the Kool-Aid, that are all in on regenerative ag, and a lot of them see the need to get premiums to make the books balance. So selling into the grain elevator might not be good enough. As far as a lot of them are interested in, you know, starting their own brands or finding, you know, specialty markets to sell into. Transport becomes a problem, of course. One guy was in Colorado selling just across the border in Salina, Kansas, and his entire premium was eaten up by transport. So infrastructure is going to be an issue. To Mariko's point, getting like distributed meat processing slaughterhouses all around, and like that kind of thing is an issue. So, and I think like there's also this weird undercurrent going on, which I'll just share here, even though it's kind of a weird place to share it. But some of these farmers see us stepping into this space, and it's feeling co-opted. It's feeling like, well, these city people are, especially with carbon markets right now, people are trying to, like, you know, run my land and tell me what to do. And so there's we have to be really thoughtful about, you know, what are their needs and what can we do to serve those needs, instead of stepping in and saying, yes, you should change how you do it because you're doing it wrong, you know. So there's that going on as well.
I mean, I think super concretely, like Elle Year working on tools that are directly for farmers to help them change what they're doing and change their practices. How do you encounter that resistance, and how do you overcome it and get adoption?
Yeah, there's such a wide range of farmers with different approaches, right? Lauren's working with some of the most brilliant people ever who are really into regenerative and trying all these different experimental things. And then at the other side of the spectrum, you have farmers that just put down the same thing every year because that's how their grandfather did it. And every mix in between. And so I think what's been interesting is learning about how different farmers respond to our product. I think one of the big barriers that we faced is that there was a lot of, I guess, like what they say in the industry is like snake oil microbials in the industry. We had to work really hard to get the trust of people to use our product because they'd seen so many other microbials that they didn't get the results they wanted from. But I think for, almost any agricultural product or practice, a lot of it comes from what happens on my neighbor's farm, what's happening in my county and my state. And so usually a lot of those conversations are about getting demonstration farms in an area where people can go see them for themselves and talk to the grower that's running it. And that part has been huge in thinking about like, how do we tap into different communities to start this conversation? And so, yeah, I think really the demo farms and being able to talk about it directly. I think the other thing that's been a challenge for us is, of course, microbes are alive. So unlike a chemical that you can put in a warehouse and forget about it, we have to be very careful to keep the microbes alive until they're planted. And so the commercial team actually does a huge lift on helping the farmers understand that this is a new product and you can't leave it out and let it freeze, or you can't mix it with chlorinated water because you need to add something to the chlorinated water to deactivate the chlorine first. And so I think, it actually comes down to a very base problem, I think, in any industry, which is just like the communication piece and the conversation piece, and that it flows both ways, to your great point, Lauren.
Christy, I'm going to slightly tweak the question here because I think we've talked about pieces of it, but how much of a premium can you actually get for these products, and how does that flow back to the farmer, and how can we get more, right?
Yeah, I'm going to tweak that question a little more, Jake. So we talk about how we as consumers have personal responsibility in sustainability, and that's true. Like recycle, compost, eat more plants. Like we all have to make those personal decisions, but companies, 100 companies are responsible for 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, right? So actually the most important thing that all of you can do, and I'm talking to you as alumni, is like figure out how your company, your spouse's company, whoever, can actually make a difference in climate change. And so what I say is that what we've learned is that, particularly like going into potentially a recession, consumers, if you ask them to pay 10% more, some will, but not everyone will. And that's always been the case, right? So instead of saying, hey, actually, companies are only going to do this if consumers pay more, we as consumers have to demand that companies actually do things in a way that makes sense for us as individuals today and in 50 years. And so as we think about that, could be whatever your role is in climate change. You could be a builder, you could be a connector, you could be an innovator, but thinking about, okay, what are the policy changes we need in order to actually make these things come to fruition? How are we going to ask companies to have good ESG goals and do more than just say, actually, I'm just going to work with farmers and give them a little bit of money and put them on my website? So there are all these things that we have to do to go that deeper level, and we can't put the onus just on consumers, because if we do that, change won't happen fast enough. We as individuals just don't have enough power in what we do in our personal lives, but in our professional lives, you have a ton of impact. And so that's where you should be thinking about, how should I be contributing to climate change?
So that's actually, I think, a perfect lead into the next question, which is, we're talking, we're alumni, I think mostly employed. But there's a lot of students here as well, and a lot of students at Olin. And how, when you're deciding what to work on as a career or as a job, how do you think about that, and how does that dovetail with ag? And I guess also, can you talk about, we'll all do this question, but can you talk about some of the specific challenges right now that you're working on that are interesting or technically interesting for folks from Olin? Lauren, you want to start? We can go. All right, we'll go the other way.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone interested in working in this career, I definitely recommend coming in and talking with people like us, because we can't get across in 3 minutes what we've been working on for 8 or 9 years. But I think one thing that might pique some interest across the audience is a major problem that I'm working on right now with clients is how do we create an agricultural system that does not burn fossil fuels to produce the food and the fiber that we need in our lives. And it's really easy to just think, oh, we just need to put batteries in all of the tractors. But I think we're already seeing that we're probably going to have a shortage of all of the different, precious metals and things like that that would be able to power those batteries. And so, yeah, that's what I'm trying to think about. If anyone's interested, please help.
I've also heard, as a tangent on the electric tractor front, there's some anti-electric tractor commentary going around right now about electric tractors don't necessarily acknowledge the challenges of how tractors get used, which is kind of all at once, right? It doesn't work if you're trying to harvest for 4 straight days and you have to charge 3 times in the middle. I'm very curious to know what Bryn and Clark think about that, so maybe we can ask that next panel.
Might be a good UOCD project.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I guess I'm a newcomer in agriculture, and I was surprised about how much engineering and tech there is. Of course, in retrospect, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of room for innovation. In particular, like I think there's a lot that's going to be happening with remote sensing. It's already started happening, and I think that's pretty interesting. I'm actually thinking about pretty similar challenges that you are. It's like our agricultural system as a whole. There's a lot of things like the industrial agriculture with chemical inputs. What is the alternative? What are we building towards? What are the different tools that we're going to take to put together to build something that's different? And thinking about, like, there's a lot of different practices, like even culturally thinking about the people that were farming the land thousands of years ago. How are they doing it with the climate they had? Thinking about the guys who are using different regenerative practices and other approaches like permaculture. In my mind, it's like there's got to be pieces that you can take of each, and it's probably highly adapted or customized to your location and where you are, what that combination looks like. But those are the type of things that I'm thinking about a lot these days. So yeah, would love to have a conversation about that also.
One of my key challenges today is how to tell the story of farmers, and I'm really lucky I get to have interactions with farmers. And 100 years ago, 1 in 20 of us was farmers, and today it's like 1 in 1,000, 10,000. It's not a lot, and so we don't have interactions with them. But farmers, we're asking them to make all these crazy changes to their world. They're the most innovative people in the world in terms of in helping us address climate change. But farmers are someone that we don't really know a lot about. Like, here are some things that have sort of blown my mind the last year. 1, farmers have 40 at-bats to figure out how to farm and turn a profit on their farm. Like, we get to try new things every day and see what happens. But they get a year to grow a harvest and then harvest it and say, okay, did what I do work well or not? And you get to change 1 or 2 variables a year. So as you think about that, these farmers that we're asking to make these huge changes, from asking them to feed the world, to say, okay, now we want you to feed the world, and can you please save the world too, please? Can you help us solve climate change? We need to figure out, okay, how can we help them along this journey, because this is not an easy thing to do. The second thing is that farmers are out in rural areas where they're not maybe seeing the environmental impacts that we do, right? So we may encounter in cities smog and acid rain and dirty rivers. And what we have to do is we have to translate what we care about and what farmers care about. And what farmers care about is their family and their property, just like we do, right? But they have a different perspective because they live in a very different place. So how do we tell that story and share that? And the majority of farmers in America are actually family farmers. And we have this, like, I think, idea of farmers as these, like, sort of industrial farms. And they've made those changes because we keep asking them to make our food more and more cheaply. Americans, as a percentage of our money that we spend way less on food than most first world countries. And so as we think about that, that's because we're eating lots of processed, like, corn and wheat and soy, and we asked farmers to do that. We said, hey, can you make this cheaper so I can buy my cereal for $2.50 a box?
Yes, I want to piggyback on that. So one of the challenges that we face is this just yawning, widening divide between rural and urban, between Democrat and Republican, between all these different ideologies. And, like, one of the roles I play is to, go into both camps and tell the stories and stuff. So one thing you guys can do, if you're ever reading an article about regenerative agriculture and there is the farmer quoted in there, or any kind of agriculture, whatever interests you, talk to them. Call them up. Go visit them. See what, and ask questions. Do not go and tell them things about farming or whatever, right? Like, you might not know anything about farming, so go ask them. See what's up. See what, what their cows look like. See what their equipment looks like. Check out their cover crop seed. Like, run your hands through a giant tote of cover crop seed. It's phenomenal. And, we can sort of bridge, like, make little stitches across this divide and maybe pull it back together, because America did not used to be like this. So.
Don't call farmers, though, during planting season or harvesting season. They won't be happy about that.
Call them from November through February.
So,
no, honestly, though, they make so much time for, like, good conversations. But yes, don't bother them.
So, what kind of jobs are available in this space at your guys' companies, or that you know of? And, if a student or alumni is looking to get into ag, what advice would you give them, and what should they be studying or majoring in now? We can go in whatever order.
I'll give some quick thoughts. For those of you guys interested in maybe the corporate sustainability route, that's kind of the space I work in, working with kind of large food and ag companies on their climate commitments, their climate goals, their carbon accounting. You can major in anything, be somewhat intelligent, and have a pulse and get hired. Our industry it's growing exponentially. I saw a press release that actually the first company I worked for out of college just got acquired by BCG, and the press release basically said BCG is looking to hire thousands more people in the coming years to work in this space. But yeah, if you're interested, I'm always happy to chat.
We have a ton of data that we analyze every season. It's thousands of field trials, dozens of protocols. So there's a lot of, if you like working with data or data engineering, that's a large part of our company. We also have a really huge biology lab that's hiring right now. And we have some, like, software engineering positions that are opening up. We'll probably be posting more of those. I guess in my career, mostly what I've done is looked for things that I thought were important or interesting and somehow talked my way into working there. So that can work for you too. If you want to major in anything and then just get good at talking to people. Yeah, that's been my strategy.
And I think that works fabulously, and the more professional way is, like, that's networking, right? And so, like, guys, you talk to Olin alumni, talk to faculty, talk to staff. We are your people that can help you figure things out. I am an entrepreneur. I don't have any open jobs. But what I'll say is that when you are thinking about this space, if you want to get into it, just talk to people. Hey, do I want to be in ESG? Because there's a lot of, like, trade-offs when it comes to different jobs. And do I want to be in data science? Like, you can do that in any sort of company, and that company just cares that you can do that job well. And so, talk to your friends and alumni, and we'll be able to help you figure that out.
Very much on the same track. We wrote a grant, and so I'm funded with a grant. We also don't have any open jobs, but I've had this fellowship journey. So also look at fellowships. If you want to explore a new space, they pay a pittance, but you can go to a different country. You can work with some people. I worked with the farmers, and so what you need for that is just to write well. And I think if you got into Olin, then that's sort of the same sort of skill set. So writing that application, telling that story, telling them why you are the exact right person, and this is the exact right time and the right partner to get this amazing thing done. And so use your network. People around you, or we can help you. I can help you review your application. Just come find me, and yeah, we can talk about that. There's so much free money out there.
And if I can plug one thing, Jake, which is that, as some of you know, that I partner with Ben Linder on doing Parcel Bs. We have a few more alumni shares open, so if you love honey that is grown in Parcel B, come talk to me after.
And I'll just echo as well on the career and job side of it. I know I'm just asking the questions really, but my company is also hiring mechanical, software, and electrical engineers, and we work on agriculture. And I don't think any of us on the panel took an agriculture class at Olin. So it's definitely not a prerequisite or requirement. So we're going to move to like an open Q&A for questions from the audience. Just shout it. Oh yeah, we can use the microphones.
Cool. Thank you so much. This was super duper informative. Thank you so much for being here. I'm super curious to hear about what y'all think about where making food production and agriculture more local fits into this space, like where urban farming, vertical farming, and just generally getting the producers closer to the consumers, how that helps at scale and not at scale, but yeah.
Do you want me to take that one? So my company builds hydroponic farms that are in shipping containers, and we deploy them throughout the world. I think it's super interesting and complicated, and it depends on your definition of sustainability and whether you're looking at a pure carbon impact or more different factors. From a pure carbon standpoint, transport is about a quarter roughly of the carbon impact for traditional ag. So I'm not talking about regenerative. That would be, I don't have the data for that on the tip of my tongue, but it's about a quarter. And so if you replace that with a vertical farm, you get rid of that quarter, but you do replace it with a lot of electricity use. And so figuring out where you get your electricity from becomes a key problem there in an absolute carbon sense. I tend to think about vertical farming as more of a adaptation solution to climate change rather than a mitigation solution, where we know, as Mariko said at the beginning, that the climate is changing and that's affecting agriculture. Like we might not really get a lettuce crop from Salinas Valley this year because of the drought in California. So that's a really big deal. What vertical farming brings is, yes, you have energy use, but you can control the environment, so we can still get food as the climate changes. And you do save a lot of water as well. So I think it's complicated.
One thing I'll add to that is not all farms are growing the same things. So here in Massachusetts, we're probably not going to see a significant amount of corn, soy, and wheat, but we do have quite a big potential to grow fruits and vegetables. And right now I think it might be a third or more of our fruits and vegetables are grown in California, where there's not a lot of water, or they're being imported from countries that have much lower labor costs and labor standards. So there is a potential kind of social and even kind of health opportunity of growing kind of local vegetables and local fruits to help offset the places where they're currently coming from.
I don't know where the nearest mic is.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I appreciate what you're doing, and really limiting nitrogen use is really helpful, but I feel like you're not addressing what is really a central problem, which is almost all of agricultural land is devoted to raising crops for food animals, and that has to change. So what can you do about that?
I'll take a stab at that. So we as consumers make choices about what we buy, right? But we also live in a society where there are corporations who decide where we buy. So as like Elle is working to make sure that row crops are grown more in a more climate-friendly way. But what we can do as all individuals can help to figure out, okay, how can we help transition away from a system where we eat so much meat or where we use so much soybean oil in our packaged goods. And so that's a decision we all get to make, and we vote for with our wallets. And I said before that not that many people are voting with their wallets, but you can be one of those people, and that can help to change that help us to transition to that society.
Yeah, I think the other part is you're absolutely right. Like the whole system of agriculture in the US has some parts that are really not ideal. I mean, even like Michael Pollan's books, thinking about should cattle even be eating corn? It's not really, their digestive system isn't suitable for it. And so that's why I'm really interested in these questions about like going back to the drawing board of we have 7 billion, 8 people, 9 billion people to feed on the planet. How can we do that? What are the systems that we can build that can achieve that and hopefully like give something back to the planet instead of continuously extracting? I don't have the answer to that, but if you want to have a conversation about it, that's my favorite thing to talk about these days, is to pull together ideas from different perspectives.
Is it? Can we also talk about the impact of cattle and regenerative systems? Because I think that's
big topic. I'll add one thing on the question and then think about that one. A lot of it comes down to policy and subsidies. So in 2019, I think about $27 billion of U.S. taxpayer dollars went to commodity agriculture, basically incentivizing a status quo of corn, soy, animal feed, a lot of nitrogen pollution. So ultimately, if we do want things to change, Christy was saying, you know, consumers have a small voice, but we ultimately do need to advocate for these kind of wider systemic changes and think about what we do want to be incentivizing and what we don't want to be incentivizing, or else we're kind of working up against $27 billion, which is a challenge. The role of cows in regenerative agriculture is quite fascinating. I don't think I can do it justice in 3 minutes, but I actually published a paper on this topic. You can look it up. It's called the White Oak Pastures LCA study. I was one of the co-authors on it, but we actually went to a farm in Georgia. They have about 3,000 acres, totally regenerative. They're doing a multi-species animal rotational grazing. So they have the cows go through, the chickens, the sheep, the goats, the turkeys, and ultimately what they've seen over the last 20 years is that their topsoil, their soil carbon levels at that farm have increased so much that it's partially offsetting the emissions, the biogenic emissions that are associated with the livestock. So they're getting to a point where they're figuring out how to close that nutrient cycle, how to make sure that the carbon cycle is functioning. And I think a really important thing is that, you know, within agriculture, if you have a healthy and balanced carbon cycle, where the carbon being stored in the soil is in balance with the emissions associated with the operation, then that operation is not actually contributing to climate change. And so I think this is a really good opportunity to be thinking about not just emissions, but really to be thinking about that holistic cycle. How do we get plants and animals working together, doing what they've been doing in nature for thousands of years?
We've talked a lot about nitrogen today. Obviously, that makes sense. It's the largest part of kind of what we need for agriculture. I was curious to talk more, hear more about potassium and phosphorus, kind of the other major nutrients you need. I know that some of that's sourced from effectively the equivalent like fossil sources. what is being done there to basically make that sustainable? Is it a real problem? Like, how much should that be a part of the conversation?
Yeah, Elle, you want to take a stab?
Yeah,
Or-
so,
yeah.
Okay, yeah, excellent question. I'm just wearing one pair of lenses right now, which is microbes. That's my small world. There are products out there that help with making a P&K salt available in the soil for the plant. I think those are really interesting, and at least for our company, we've just been trying to be good at one thing. But what we're starting to do is start branching out and testing with other products that can be complementary. And those are definitely some of the ones that we're trialing together with to see if we can get a more complete nutritional profile. And I'm not sure why, but most of the producers that I work with are completely off P&K, P&K. So I think maybe by fostering the on-farm ecosystem, I mean, nitrogen is the big one, right? And then these other two. And I don't know where we figured out that plants only need 3 things. Because that's also not true. So yeah, a lot of the producers that I work with still use a lot of nitrogen. Some guys have gone totally off it. Sometimes that's been a train wreck. Sometimes that's been okay. And then P&K aren't really talked about very much. And then you start to get, as these cycles build and as all these microbes and a lot of other microbes just sort of come back to the land, you get all sorts of cycling of iron and copper and other things. And you were mentioning antioxidants and phytochemicals and stuff like that. So holistically, if you rebuild the ecosystem, I think you're golden.
The other thing I'll do is put nitrogen in context. So if we sort of look at the life cycle assessment of growing corn, half of the carbon of the greenhouse gas impact is from nitrogen. 90% of the impact of growing coffee is from nitrogen. So as you think about the levers that you have to pull in order to make agriculture more climate friendly, nitrogen's just like it's a really big piece of the pie.
Hi, thank you for your work in this area. I've heard a few allusions to the current state of the policy landscape and the incentives that it sets up. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what an ideal policy landscape would include, and are there any countries in the world that do have closer to that model policy landscape?
Who wants to take a stab at that one?
I mean, the policy side of things is a whole can of worms, and I've only barely started scratching the surface. But one of the things that we have in the U.S. Is we don't have anyone kind of monitoring how much supply are we producing. So you have a series of individual farmers basically making individual decisions on, how many acres of corn they're going to plant, how many acres of soy, how many acres of wheat. But then what ends up happening is at the end of the season, if a bunch of individual farmers all decided to plant corn, we have too much corn. So the price of corn goes down. We have to find more and more ways to use that corn, which ends up typically going to feeding animals in confinement. It goes into more and more processed foods. So, there are controversial ways of dealing with that, things like supply management. In the US, it would be the most corrupt system ever. But there are ways. I think Canada has a system in place where they basically give farmers an allocation for some of the key crops and say, look, we don't need every farmer to be growing corn. We need this much corn to feed our country, so here's how much corn we want to grow. There are obviously problems with that system as well, but kind of a potential thing to think about.
Yeah, and the policy side is a mess. I'll just give you one example. So our project is funded via the USDA and through an organization called the NRCS, and they are responsible for all of the cover crops and the government's push for soil health. But just across the cubicle wall is the risk management agency, and they're responsible for crop insurance. And those rules, like if you do what the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, does, you get kicked out of crop insurance sometimes. And like they're a cubicle wall away. So they're just, I mean, it's wild. I don't know how we get through this. I know there is actually a big data effort going on. Talk to me after if you're interested. I'll look up the name. And they're trying to rewrite RMA's risk assessments based on satellite data and watching, like, if somebody is more into soil health, are they more resilient to the floods and the droughts? And then could we actually say that that's good farming practice, not the current sort of conventional way, which is defined as good farming practice, which is what the crop insurance is based on.
There's some exciting things around the urban farming legal and compliance landscape as well. I mean, we've had farmers go for USDA loans that get rejected because they claim 2 acres of output on a small urban lot, things like that, and then we go to court and testify to get them their loans and fight it. We have successfully fought in some cases, but it's complicated for sure. Elle, did you want to comment more?
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think the policy absolutely has to support the farmers. Like, as Lauren has said, they're the ones putting all the risk on the line, and when they're taking these sustainable practices, they get penalized for it. And so Tiana's going to be talking with Clark and Bryn, and Indigo is doing some really great work with getting rewards to farmers for like sustainable practices. And I think historically, like a lot of the legislation around, you know, sustainable farming, the farmers often get blamed for you're using too much inputs, you're using too much chemicals, and they just do so much work for all of us. I think like any policy has to have them at their heart and be able to support them in, adopting sustainable practices that will continue to help us in the planet.
Yes? Haha! Thank you so much. Excellent panel. I was wondering how you kind of deal with the sustainable food thing while also thinking about like food justice. Because like, you know, I think I heard this a few years ago, like the lowest dollar to calorie ratio is a bag of potato chips. So like we're already in like this terrible place of giving people who need fresh, wholesome produce, that produce, and it seems like a lot of initiatives to like be more sustainable and eat local are just getting more expensive. So like how do you kind of balance these two and like deal with it?
There are no good answers there, and I might do a Mark Somerville tap dance right now. Because, right, so like regenerative practices, a lot of the things that we're saying is like, actually, I'm not going to use that input. Instead, I'm going to use more labor, more people. People are expensive, right? And so that's why like a lot of the brands I work with that are in Whole Foods cost more money because their cost of goods are actually more. It's not that they're making more money. In fact, a lot of them are making less money than like the General Mills of the world. And so it's a really tough situation, and what you're going to have to say is like, okay, some people are going to work from the top down and some people are going to work from the bottom up. And I don't know that much about the bottom up, about actually getting food that's accessible to people that are of lower socioeconomic class. But what I'll say is that the brands that are working and are at the more premium level, their goal is like when Annie's got bought by General Mills, they changed General Mills, right? So General Mills has a long way to go, but they are much more sustainable today. They're thinking about regenerative ag. They're putting resources towards it. They have a lot to figure out. But if they hadn't bought Annie's, they wouldn't have that internal experience in there. And so what Annie's did, even with their, I don't know, $1.99 mac and cheese versus Kraft 99-cent mac and cheese, you know, they're helping that transition because that's the goal. We as small brands know that like the 1,000 boxes of crackers that I sell today is not going to change the world. But if I can change Triscuit, gosh, we're making some progress there, right? So that's the goal of actually having consumers say, hey, I'm going to raise my hand and say I care about that so that the big companies actually pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important piece, and you know, the money is only one part of it, but ultimately, you know, even the cost that we are paying at the grocery store is not reflecting the true cost of food. I think a recent report said that for every dollar a consumer spends on food, there's $3 of environmental health and social impact. We're not seeing in that price tag. And again, if we think about subsidies, there's on the order of $27 billion going into creating our current conventional system. And there is an opportunity to put some of that money towards, subsidizing healthier food or, creating a better system that's going to be more equitable. But we need people kind of thinking about that and being able to voice those concerns.
And there is one central place where this comes together. So the food bill, or the farm bill, which gets renewed every 5 years or something like that, it has all of this in it. It has all these subsidies we're talking about for conventional. It has all the crop insurance. It has the SNAP program and that kind of thing. And so that gets negotiated all at the same time as one package. And so if you're into policy, get in that.
Or if you vote.
Yeah, advocate for it. I don't know exactly what to advocate for because it does get complicated, but that's where it all happens.
Any more questions? Joe? Mike incoming.
A lot of the talk so far has been very America-focused. Is this an American problem or is it a global problem?
Yeah, it's definitely a global problem. Putting the nitrogen hat on, unfortunately, like the Ukraine-Russian war had really detrimental effects on the flow of both grain. They were both grain providers and fertilizer. And what's near and dear to my heart is the African continent, and I'm learning a lot more about agricultural fertilizer there, and it's a huge challenge there. A lot of things are a little bit reversed. Like for example, the primary example being in the U.S., growers put down a lot of synthetic fertilizer because that they're always betting it's going to be their best year yet. They're going to make the best crop. And for an East African smallholder farmer, it's more like I don't have the cash flow right now to put down this fertilizer. This is not a good investment for me, and so they tend to under-apply. But that means that they're also not growing as much food as would be useful to help with food security. So that's just two examples, but it's really made me think about like how local this is. Like any environment, when you think about what's there, the challenge is going to be slightly different, and the solution's also going to be different depending on what the conditions are there.
I know Tiana in the second panel as well, who works with Indigo on carbon, their carbon program. They do a ton of work in South America, Brazil. There's a lot of issues worldwide for sure. So I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank all the panelists. Give them a hand. And thanks to everyone for coming and listening. I hope everyone's walking away maybe with a renewed sense of urgency around agriculture and what we can do as consumers and in our careers. And I'm going to hand it back over to Sally. Thank you.
All I can say is, wow, so impressive. Talk about doing something. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I do want to once again mention that there will be a follow-up to this terrific conversation coming out in around November, so look for some publicity about that. That will be a live panel on Zoom with Brennan Clark and Tiana, and we're hoping to pull in one or two more of these terrific food-focused professionals. What I'd like to invite everyone now is to head outside. Thank you so much for coming. I think this has really been a really good panel. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Jake. You did a great job moderating. And next, it will be Choose Your Own Adventure. Lots of fun stuff going on. There is Make and Take in the Olin shop. Get back in there and have some fun. Lindsay Gordon has written a book. It's all of a sudden a bestseller. Yay, Lindsay. So she'll be sitting in the Oval talking about, I don't know, what it's like to write a book or careers or whatever you want to talk about, old times. A lot of, I'm sure you've got a lot of stories with Lindsay in 07. Alumni Student Connections will be happening in the Oval. The student vehicle team will be showcasing what they're up to this year. Design, Build, Fly, Baja, Rocketry, OEM, go out and have some fun. Thanks again, everybody, for coming.